Do you know why I stopped you tonight?
No, officer. Could you explain the reason for the stop?
You match a description from a reported incident in the area.
Am I being detained for that, or am I free to leave?
You know that cold, sudden drop in your stomach when the red and blue lights flash in your rearview mirror. Even when you know exactly where you're going and haven't broken a single law. That is the exact feeling Marcus experienced at 5 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday night. Right before a routine traffic stop unraveled into a masterclass on how quickly constitutional rights can evaporate on a dark city street, the Oak Park neighborhood was caught in the awkward, restless middle stage of urban transition. A place where shiny new farm-to-table bistros shared brick walls with decades-old laundromats and faded corner stores. It was an area where demographics overlapped, where the evening crowd was a patchwork of longtime locals and young professionals looking for cheaper rent. Rain had fallen earlier in the evening, leaving the asphalt slick and reflective under the amber glow of the streetlights. The air was damp and carried the faint, savory scent of garlic and roasted meats from the ventilation fan of Lumina, a late-night diner that had just locked its doors for the night. Inside his 2018 charcoal gray Honda Accord, Marcus adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life, a steady, comforting vibration, followed by the soft, rhythmic clicking of the heater fan kicking on. Beside him sat his younger brother, David. David was 32, a freelance graphic designer who had spent the last 2 hours at the diner sketching out wireframes on his tablet while Marcus, a 34-year-old architect, reviewed blueprints. They were both exhausted. David, wearing a dark green hoodie pulled up slightly against the night chill, was tapping his fingers on his knee to the low, muted jazz playing through the car's speakers. Marcus, dressed in a tailored navy peacoat, checked his mirrors twice. A lifelong habit born of a methodical mind, the tires made a wet, tearing sound as the car pulled away from the curb and merged onto the empty two-lane avenue. 3 blocks away, idling in the shadow parking lot of an abandoned textile mill, sat Police Chief Thomas Hayes. Though he held a high rank in a smaller adjoining precinct, he still took the occasional night patrol, claiming it kept his instincts sharp. He was a 22-year veteran of the force, a man whose career was built in an era when policing relied heavily on gut feelings rather than data-driven analytics. Tonight, his gut was exhausted. He took a sip of lukewarm, bitter coffee from a styrofoam cup. The radio on his dashboard cracked to life with a brief burst of static, followed by the dispatcher's monotonous voice issuing a bolo of be on the lookout. There had been a break-in at a commercial storage facility across town. The description was agonizingly vague. 2 males, dark clothing, fleeing the scene in a mid-sized, dark-colored Sedan. No license plate. No specific make or model, just a broad brushstroke of suspicion painted across the night. Hayes rubbed his heavy eyes. As he looked up, Marcus's gray Honda Accord drove slowly past the mill. It was a dark sedan. There were 2 men inside. They were wearing dark jackets, and they were driving exactly 2 miles under the speed limit, coming to a full, complete stop at the blinking red light. To Marcus, he was simply being a safe, cautious driver on wet roads. To Hayes, filtered through decades of confirmation bias. Driving perfectly at 11:30 at night in a transitional neighborhood looked like an overcompensation. It looked like someone trying desperately not to get pulled over. Hayes shifted his cruiser into drive. The heavy, low growl of the police interceptor echoed off the brick buildings as he pulled out of the lot, his headlights illuminating the rain-slick trunk of the Honda. Inside the Accord, the ambiance shifted instantly. The jazz music felt suddenly hollow. Marcus's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. He saw the headlights pacing him, matching his speed perfect. The tension in the car became a physical weight, thick and suffocating. David stopped tapping his fingers. The soft rustle of his hoodie against the seat was the only sound as he subtly shifted his posture, sitting up straighter. Marcus didn't speed up, nor did he slow down. He maintained a steady, precise 30 miles per hour, his hands gripping the steering wheel firmly at the 10 and 2 positions. They both waited for the cruiser to turn off, to pass them, to hunt somewhere else. Instead, the blinding, strobing flash of red and blue lights ignited the cabin of the Honda, casting sharp, moving shadows across the dashboard. Marcus released a slow, controlled breath. He engaged his turn signal, the rhythmic clicking now sounding like a countdown, and pulled smoothly into a well-lit parking lot of a closed pharmacy. He immediately shifted the car into park, turned off the engine, and rolled down all 4 windows to ensure complete visibility. He reached up and switched on the overhead dome light, bathing the interior in a warm, revealing glow. He placed both hands flat on the top of the steering wheel. David, mirroring his brother without needing to be told, placed his hands flat on his knees. It was a synchronized practice routine, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken rules of survival when navigating unexpected authority. Through the open window, the ambient sounds of the city flooded in the distant wail of an ambulance, the hum of the pharmacy's neon sign, and the heavy, deliberate crunch of leather boots walking across the wet gravel. Chief Hayes approached the driver's side, his heavy utility belt squeaking softly with each step. He stopped slightly behind the B-pillar of the car, a standard tactical position, shining his high-lumen flashlight directly into the cabin. The beam swept over David's face, then settled aggressively on Marcus, catching the glare of his glasses. The light was blinding, intentionally disorienting. Evening, driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. Hayes said his voice was gravelly, devoid of any conversational warmth. It was an order disguised as a greeting. Marcus blinked against the glare, keeping his hands firmly on the wheel. Good evening. Officer, my license is in my wallet in my back right pocket. The registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. May I reach for them? Hayes kept the light fixed on Marcus's face. Slowly, the sound of the glove box unlatching clicked sharply in the quiet car. David reached over, his movements deliberate and unhurried, extracting the small plastic sleeve holding the documents. Marcus carefully retrieved his wallet. Pulling out his driver's license, he handed the stack of paperwork through the window. Hayes took them, stepping back slightly to examine them under his flashlight. He glanced at the names, then back at the brothers. Do you know why I pulled you over tonight? Hayes asked. His tone flat, carefully designed to elicit an admission of guilt. I don't, officer. Marcus replied, his voice calm, steady, and entirely free of hostility. I was maintaining the speed limit and my vehicle is in full working order. We've had some burglaries in the area tonight. Hayes said, leaning in slightly, his eyes scanning the interior of the car. You boys match the description of the suspects. Two men, dark clothing, dark sedan. David shifted slightly in his seat, the leather creaking. Officer, we just left Lumina Diner 3 blocks back. We've been there for 2 hours. Hayes' gaze snapped to David. I didn't ask you, he said sharply. He turned back to Marcus. Where are you headed? Home. Marcus said calmly, to my apartment on the west side. Hayes continued to sweep his flashlight across the back seat. The beam illuminated David's black canvas messenger bag resting on the floorboards. The bag was bulky, filled with a laptop, chargers, and sketch pads. To a seasoned officer looking for stolen goods, a nopake, heavy-looking bag is exactly what they want to see to confirm their own narrative. Hayes' internal bias, subtly shaped by a career of looking for the worst in people, had already constructed a story. The cautious driving, the rehearsed hand placements, the dark clothing, the bag in the back. He was piecing together a puzzle using the wrong pieces. What's in the bag? Hayes asked, his voice dropping an octave. My computer and work supplies. David answered, his voice tighter now. The frustration beginning to leak through his practiced restraint. Mind, if I take a look, Hayes asked. This was the pivot point. This was the exact moment where the boundary of the law is tested on a dark street. Under the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution, a citizen is protected against unreasonable searches and seizures. During a traffic stop, an officer can legally investigate the initial reason for the stop, such as a broken taillight or speeding. If the stop was based on a Terry v. Ohio standard of reasonable articulable suspicion, the officer can briefly detain the individuals to confirm or dispel that specific suspicion, but they cannot extend the stop into a generalized fishing expedition without independent new probable cause. The Bolo description was a dark sedan and dark clothes, a description so overly broad it could match 1,000 vehicles in the city. There was no specific evidence linking Marcus or David to the crime. Asking for consent to search is a legal tactic used by law enforcement. If the citizen says yes, the Fourth Amendment requirement for a warrant is waived, but refusing consent is a constitutional right, and the assertion of a right cannot legally be used to manufacture probable cause. Marcus knew this. He was an architect. His entire life was built on understanding structures, boundaries, and rules. He took a slow breath, feeling the heavy weight of the moment. Officer, Marcus said, his voice respectful but entirely firm, I do not consent to any searches of my vehicle or our belongings. The silence that followed was incredibly loud. The hum of the pharmacy sign seemed to buzz with a new intensity. Hayes's jaw tightened. Officers who rely heavily on compliance and authority often view the invocation of rights not as a legal boundary, but as a challenge, a symptom of guilt. In Hayes's mind, innocent people had nothing to hide. Therefore, refusal equaled suspicion. It was a fundamental procedural flaw, a dangerous shortcut in legal reasoning that happens thousands of times a day on American roads. Step out of the vehicle. Hayes ordered. The request wasn't legally invalid under Pennsylvania v. Mims. An officer can order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop for officer safety. But the context mattered. The stop was already stretching beyond its legal scope. Am I under arrest? Marcus asked, not unbuckling his seatbelt yet. I said, step out of the vehicle. Hayes repeated, his hand instinctively dropping to rest on his heavy utility belt right above his radio. The atmosphere in the car shattered. The delicate, restrained calm evaporated. David pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. With a soft digital chime, he started recording. The glowing red timer appeared on the screen, illuminating David's tense face. Officer, Marcus said, keeping his hands visible, I will step out, but I want it noted that I am complying under duress, and I still do not consent to any searches. Marcus unclipped his seatbelt. The metallic click was sharp. He opened the door, the wet night air washing over him, and stepped onto the damp pavement. He stood at his full height, slightly taller than Hayes, which only added to the unspoken, simmering tension. Hayes instructed him to move to the rear of the vehicle. Marcus complied, his dress shoes crunching against the loose gravel. From the passenger seat, David kept his phone raised, capturing every frame through the rain-streaked window. At that exact moment, the low, rushing sound of tires approaching from the main avenue grew louder. A second police cruiser swung into the pharmacy parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the scene before cutting out. The doors opened, and Officer Miller stepped out. Miller was younger, perhaps in his late 20s, part of a newer generation of officers trained heavily in de-escalation, bias recognition, and recent case law. He walked over briskly, his boots splashing in a small puddle. Chief, Miller said, nodding respectfully to his superior. Everything, all right, here, got a refusal to search. Hayes said quietly, his eyes still locked on Marcus. Occupants matched the bolo. They're acting nervous. Miller looked at Marcus. He saw a man in a tailored peacoat, hands resting calmly on the trunk of a meticulously clean Honda. He looked through the window and saw David holding a phone, recording. Before Miller could respond, the heavy black radio on his shoulder cracked to life. The audio was clear, crisp, and devoid of static. The dispatcher's voice echoed loudly in the quiet parking lot. Dispatch to all units. Update on the commercial storage break-in. Suspects apprehended on foot by County Transit Police near the rail yard. 2 Caucasian males. Suspects abandoned a rusted blue Ford Taurus. Found in possession of bright yellow duffel bags containing stolen copper wire. Cancel bolo. The radio transmission hung in the air like a physical object. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was profound. The sound of the idling Honda engine seemed to mock the tension of the previous 10 minutes. Miller glanced at Hayes. Hayes' face remained a mask of hardened stone, but his eyes betrayed a sudden, uncomfortable realization. The narrative he had built in his head, the absolute certainty of his gut instinct, had completely collapsed. The procedural house of cards had fallen. He hadn't stopped them because of a concrete, articulable suspicion. He had stopped them because it was late. They were 2 men of color in a neighborhood that was changing. And his brain had filled in the gaps with assumptions rather than facts. He had pushed to search a car based on a hunch that was fundamentally, demonstrably false. There was no explosive argument. There was no dramatic apology. The reality of these encounters is rarely cinematic in its resolution. It is usually awkwardly bureaucratic. Hayes cleared his throat. A small, uncomfortable sound. He looked down at the licenses and registration still gripped in his left hand. He walked slowly back to the driver's side door, reaching through the open window to place the documents on the driver's seat. "You're free to go," Hayes said gruffly, turning his back and walking rapidly toward his cruiser without making eye contact with Marcus. Marcus stood by the trunk for a long moment, the cool night air biting at his neck. He didn't feel relieved. He felt a deep, hollow exhaustion. He walked back to the door, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door with a solid thud. David stopped recording, the screen going dark. They didn't speak. Marcus put the car in drive and pulled out of the lot, leaving the 2 police cruisers sitting in the glow of the neon pharmacy sign. The story didn't end that night. Unlike the countless undocumented stops that happen every day, fading into the ether of forgotten police interactions. Marcus was meticulous. The next morning, armed with David's video, the time-stamped diner receipt, and his deep understanding of civic procedure, Marcus filed a formal complaint with the Civilian Oversight Board. He didn't go to the media. He went directly to the legal framework. He requested the dash cam and body cam footage through the Freedom of Information Act. The consequences unfolded with the agonizingly slow pace of municipal government. There was no instant justice. Chief Hayes was not fired in a dramatic press conference. However, the internal investigation, forced into the light by the undeniable evidence of the recording and the dispatch radio logs, revealed a critical error in judgment. The Oversight Board concluded that Hayes lacked the requisite reasonable suspicion to initiate the stop, and that his attempt to leverage a refusal of search into an escalation violated department policy on Fourth Amendment protocols. Hayes was quietly handed a 2-week unpaid suspension, reassigned to daytime administrative duty pending mandatory retraining on constitutional law and implicit bias, and a permanent mark was placed in his personnel file. It was a bureaucratic victory, a small course correction in a massive system, but it was a victory nonetheless. The public records request also sparked a local journalist to dig deeper, uncovering a subtle but statistically significant pattern of prolonged, fruitless Terry stops initiated by older officers in the transitioning Oak Park district. prompting a sweeping city council review of patrol tactics. The incident left a permanent mark on Marcus and David. It changed the way they drove, the way they interacted with their own city, and the way they viewed the flashing lights in the distance. The system had technically worked in the end. The mistake was caught, the rights were upheld, and a form of accountability was enforced, but the lingering trauma remained a quiet shadow sitting in the back seat of every late night drive. It leaves us with a necessary, unsettling question. How many constitutional rights are quietly surrendered on dark, empty streets every single night, simply because the driver didn't know the law, didn't have a camera, or was too terrified to say the word no? The law is only as strong as the people willing to stand calmly in the dark and demand that it be followed.